This video is about the use of macroeconomic policies to reduce fiscal deficits and the national debt. Theoretically, it's from theme 4, but I think it would be also good for a lower sixth student who's just preparing for their end of year exams. Before we go any further, we need to clarify two important terms: fiscal deficit and national debt. A lot of students get confused by these two terms. So let's start off with the fiscal deficit. A fiscal deficit is a shortfall in a government's tax income compared with its spending. Governments that choose to run fiscal deficits are spending beyond their means. That's what it effectively amounts to. A fiscal deficit is calculated as a percentage of gross domestic product, or simply as total pounds spent in excess of tax income. The national debt, in contrast, is the total stock of public debt. It's the total amount of money that the government owes to its bondholders. The national debt will go up whenever the government runs a fiscal deficit. So let's look at some real numbers. In this case, it's the British government's fiscal policy over an 8-year period. So if we begin at 2010-2011, the government in that year planned to spend £141 billion more than they were planning to collect in tax. So their fiscal deficit stood at £141 billion. That was the amount that the government was planning to borrow in that year. The following year, the deficit fell slightly to £124 billion. They're still borrowing. There's still a shortfall in tax compared to government spending. But that fiscal deficit is slightly smaller. The rate of borrowing has decreased somewhat. The following year, for some reason, the fiscal deficit increased again to 137 billion. But from that point, there was some good work done by the government, and you can see from the numbers there, with every passing year, they managed to reduce the fiscal deficit. So in 2018-2019, they managed to get the fiscal deficit down to £32 billion a year. That was the amount that they borrowed in that year. The row below it shows the national debt, which is the total stock of debt. So it begins at 1,214 billion. The fiscal deficit in the following year was 124 billion. So the national debt at the end of 2011-2012 was 1,338 billion. And we get to that figure by adding the national debt from the previous year, 1,214 billion, to the fiscal deficit the year after, 124 billion. So it's those two numbers added up that gets the national debt of 1,338 billion. The following year, the government borrowed 137 billion. So the national debt at the end of that year, 1,475, is calculated by adding the national debt the year before, 1,338, plus the amount that the government borrowed in that following year, 137. So you can see that reducing the fiscal deficit, it's not going to lower the national debt, it's actually going to increase it. You can see that every single year here the government was running fiscal deficits. So it was borrowing, so it was adding to the total stock of debt. So this is pretty important, and it gets to the heart of the difference between deficit and debt. These are flow and stock concepts. Deficit is the flow, debt is the stock. Whenever you run a fiscal deficit, that's an inbound flow into the total stock of debt. Economics isn't taught as part of the national curriculum in Britain. As a consequence of that, hardly anybody understands the difference between fiscal deficit and national debt. And some politicians don't seem to know the difference either. Some probably do and choose to use the information asymmetry that they enjoy to mislead people. So a great example was David Cameron and George Osborne, who repeatedly told the British government that their policy of reducing the fiscal deficit was dealing with Britain's debt. As you know, that's not true. If you reduce the fiscal deficit, the government is still borrowing every year. Therefore, it's still adding to the total stock of public debt. So this is really, really important for people to understand. You don't deal with the debt problem by reducing the fiscal deficit. If you reduce the fiscal deficit, you're going to be adding to the debt because the government is still borrowing. So it's really important that you understand that. Don't conflate, don't confuse fiscal deficits with national debts. If a government really wants to reduce its national debt, it's got to run a fiscal surplus. A fiscal surplus is a situation where the government's tax income for the year ahead is greater than its planned government spending. The difference there is the surplus, and that surplus can be used to pay down the total stock of debt. A good example of a country that's managed to achieve this recently is Croatia. Croatian politicians managed to run a fiscal surplus of 22 billion koruna in 2019-2020, which was a great achievement. And they did that by raising taxes and by cutting government spending. And by running a fiscal surplus, they managed to pay down some of the Croatian government's national debt. And that's really important because the national debt determines, or it partially determines, the total amount of government spending on debt interest. And if you can reduce the debt, ceteris paribus, you'll reduce the amount of money that the government has to spend every year on servicing the debt, paying debt interest, which means that there's more tax income available to spend on public services. So well done, Croatia. So we've pinned down the main difference between deficit and debt. What we now need to look at is ways in which governments might try to reduce a fiscal deficit. And there are very, very different lines of argument. The Keynesians, in essence, they believe that the best way to deal with a fiscal deficit is by trying to pursue reflationary demand-side policies that are intended to create economic growth. So, yeah, the Keynesian view then is reduce the fiscal deficit by pursuing policies that are designed to create economic growth. The diagram shows the relationship between tax income and government spending relative to real GDP. If we look at tax income, which is the green line, it's upward sloping, and the reason for that is that as the economy grows, there'll be more people in work, and if there's more people in work, there'll be more people paying income tax. If there's more people in work earning income, there'll be also more money spent on goods and services, so the government will also collect more in indirect tax too. A healthier economy that's bigger probably also means that the government's corporation tax incomes will also rise. Corporation tax being a tax on company profit. So that's why the green line, tax income, slopes up. In contrast, there's a negative relationship between real GDP and government spending. So why is this? Well, as the economy gets bigger and there are more people employed, there'll be fewer people eligible to claim means-tested welfare benefits such as job seekers allowance, free school meals, free dental care on the NHS, etc. So as the real GDP level rises, there'll be more people employed, so there'll be fewer people qualifying for these means-tested welfare benefits, and that's why government spending falls as real GDP rises. So let's take a starting point of NY1. At NY1, economic activity is pretty low. So we've got high unemployment. High unemployment means that the government is spending a lot of money, G1, on welfare benefits because there's a lot of people out of work. Also, the tax income is quite low. It's only T1. And for the reasons that we've just gone into, economic activity is very low, not many people are employed, not many people are paying tax. So at NY1, the government will be running a fiscal deficit because government spending, G1, is greater than tax income, T1. So what Keynesians would say is that if we want to get rid of that fiscal deficit of G1 minus T1, we need to create some economic growth. We need to increase the real GDP. So if we can increase real GDP from MY1 to MY2, the government spending on welfare benefits and such like will fall from G1 to G2. At the same time, there'll be more people in work, more people paying tax. So tax income will rise from T1 to T2. So the chart hypothesizes that at NY2, the government will actually be running a balanced budget where government spending, G2, is now the same as tax income, T2. So if you're running a balanced budget, obviously the fiscal deficit is zero and the national debt will be stable, job done. So in summary then, what Keynesians argue is that the best way to reduce a fiscal deficit is by increasing real GDP. And to do that, you need to create economic growth. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to next. Keynesians believe that the level of economic activity is determined by the level of aggregate demand. They claim that the economy can come into equilibrium at any level of output and employment so long as the level of AD is stable. So on the diagram there, the starting point is NY1 and we're in equilibrium producing NY1 because the level of aggregate demand is low and stable at AD1. There's only enough spending in the economy to buy up NY1 at an average price level of AP1. There's loads of spare capacity in the economy, unemployment's bound to be very high, and as a result of that we're probably running big fiscal deficits because the government is spending an arm and a leg on welfare benefits, and because there's not that many people in work, there's not that much being paid in tax. So what Keynesians say is we need to increase aggregate demand. If we can increase aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2, firms will respond to the increase in sales by producing more. And they'll do this because they've got spare capacity at the moment. And when firms have spare capacity, they'll always respond to an increase in aggregate demand by raising output rather than by raising price. So when firms start to produce more, the equilibrium level of real GDP will start to increase and it will reach NY2 if the government can increase aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. So what sorts of tactics could a government use to increase the level of aggregate demand? Well, obviously what we're looking at here is theme 2, demand side policies, of which there are two. Monetary policy, so that involves the central bank changing interest rates or changing the supply of money, and the other one would be fiscal policy, which involves the government using its budget to influence the level of aggregate demand. So in this case, if you want to increase AD from AD1 to AD2, the central bank will either have to cut interest rates or the government will have to run a bigger fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficits increase aggregate demand because government spending is an injection, taxation is a withdrawal. A deficit is a situation where G exceeds T, so therefore that implies that there's a net injection of spending taking place in the economy. So to summarise this slide, what we're saying here is that Keynesians believe that the best way of reducing a fiscal deficit is to create economic growth, and to create economic growth you need to increase aggregate demand, and you can do that through either expansionary fiscal policy or slack monetary policy. Keynesians say that to reduce a fiscal deficit in the long run, it might be necessary to run a bigger fiscal deficit in the short run. That statement might sound paradoxical, weird, but that's exactly what the Keynesians say. It reminds me of the Disney Pixar film Cars. In it, Doc Hudson, which is the old blue car pictured, is trying to teach Lightning McQueen how to corner on a dirt track racing circuit. And Doc Hudson basically says to Lightning McQueen, if you want to turn right, you have to turn left, which is sort of counterintuitive. You know, like, how is it that if you want to turn right, you have to turn left? Well, for me, I think that this situation, it sort of mirrors what Keynesians say about what governments have to do to reduce fiscal deficits. You know, in effect, what they're saying is that if you want to reduce the fiscal deficit in the long run, you'll need to create growth. To create growth, though, you'll need to increase aggregate demand. And to create that increase in aggregate demand, you'll need to run bigger fiscal deficits in the short run. So in effect, to reduce the deficit in the long run, you'll need to increase it in the short run to create the economic growth that you reckon you'll need to reduce the fiscal deficit. I hope that's reasonably clear, but it's a very counterintuitive idea. So one more time, what we're saying here is that Keynesians believe that the key to reducing the fiscal deficit is the creation of economic growth. Make a bigger economy. That will automatically deal with the shortfall in tax income. A bigger economy means that there'll be more people paying tax and there'll be fewer people claiming welfare. So how do we create that bigger economy? Answer is fiscal stimulus. We need to speculate to accumulate. We need to run a bigger fiscal deficit now to create the growth needed to eliminate a fiscal deficit in the long run. Of course, a lot of this depends on the power of the fiscal multiplier. Keynesians are assuming that it's well above 1, and that when you spend and borrow an extra £10 billion, it will create growth of 30, 40 billion pounds, and that extra growth will create the extra tax income needed to more than cover the money that you borrowed previously when you were using the fiscal stimulus. The classical school completely disagree with these Keynesian ideas that you've got to speculate to accumulate, that you've got to increase the fiscal deficit now in order to decrease it in the future. They argue that the best way to reduce a fiscal deficit is pretty simple: cut government spending. And if you're still struggling, then you need to maybe increase taxes. But the go-to plan, first off, would be to reduce a fiscal deficit by rolling back the frontiers of the state and cutting government spending to a level that you can afford through the taxes that you're collecting. So let's take an example of a country that actually has done this. In this case, it's Canada between 1993 and 1999. So Canada had a big stonking national debt, and they were adding to it every year by running fiscal deficits. So there was a general election and a government was elected that pledged that they were going to try to run fiscal surpluses to pay down the debt. And that's exactly what they managed to do. You can see that they cut government spending by £20 billion over the period from 94 to 98. And at the same time, they raised an extra £19 billion of tax income. So they went from running a fiscal deficit of £33 billion a year to running a fiscal surplus of £8 billion a year. So this just shows you that fiscal austerity can actually work. It is possible. Fiscal deficits aren't inevitable. If you cut government spending and you increase taxes, it's possible to turn a fiscal deficit into a fiscal surplus. And if you're running a fiscal surplus, you'll start to pay down the total stock of public debt. You'll reduce the national debt. Keynesians are very hostile to the idea of fiscal austerity, to tax increases and cuts in government spending. They say that if you cut government spending and you raise taxes, you'll crash the economy by decreasing aggregate demand. The classical school disagree with this. And at the heart of it is their belief that the level of output and employment is determined by supply side factors, not the level of aggregate demand, like what the Keynesians believe. So let's think about these supply side factors. So according to the classical school, the long run aggregate supply curve, that's determined by this concept of general equilibrium, which is a situation where every single micro market in the economy is clearing. And that output at general equilibrium is determined entirely by supply side factors. Factors like the size of a country's workforce, factors like incentives to work, factors like productivity, factors such as entrepreneurial zeal and innovation within the economy. Nothing to do with changing the price of money, the interest rate, or playing around with government spending. So the diagram shows the classical vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. Output at general equilibrium is MY1, and what we're seeing here is that if the government goes for government spending cuts that lead to a fall in aggregate demand, there will be no fall in real GDP. All that happens is that you get some deflation. A fall in the total amount of spending means that the average price level falls, and that fall in the average price level will allow a lesser amount of spending to buy up the same amount of GDP. So this is pretty important because it drives a train right through the Keynesian hypothesis that austerity is self-defeating. You don't need to worry about cratering the economy and cratering the tax base of the economy if you cut government spending. It is possible to cut government spending and reduce the fiscal deficit, and there won't be a cataclysmic fall in tax income because there won't be a cataclysmic fall in real GDP if you end up operating with a lower level of aggregate demand because the state has reduced its spending. Indeed, it could be that cutting government spending might actually help the economy to grow. So the diagram is one that shows the labour market operating in equilibrium, and the other image you can see there is about tax credits. Tax credits are paid to low-paid workers. They top up their wages, people that work in shops and Deliveroo drivers and such like, to a level that they can live off. A lot of people work part-time because they can have their part-time wages topped up with tax credits. So let's float in a hypothesis that if you were to scrap tax credits, people who are currently working part-time might have to start thinking about working full-time. If that was to happen, the supply of labour would increase from S1 to S2. That would cause a fall in the wage rate. That might help the UK to become more internationally competitive. So that could help the UK to achieve export-led growth. And in addition, you'll see that the increase in the supply of labour also causes the natural rate of employment to increase from E1 to E2. Again, just remember this from theme 2, that the natural rate of employment is a level of employment created when the labour market is in equilibrium. The increase in the natural rate of employment will increase output at general equilibrium from MY1 to MY2. So that's why the long-run aggregate supply curve has shifted from LRAS1 to LRAS2 as a direct consequence of cutting government spending on welfare. At the heart of this is this idea that sometimes cutting government spending, rather than harming the economy, it can actually do it some good, providing that you're cutting government spending on things that are creating disincentives to work. So, if fiscal austerity via welfare cuts ends up boosting GDP, then rather than tax incomes falling when the government cuts spending, you might actually find tax incomes rising because GDP's risen and there's more economic activity, for the government to tax. The Laffer curve is also relevant here. The Laffer curve shows how the tax rate affects the total amount of tax income that the government is able to collect. Now, in the UK, we're probably operating somewhere in this pink zone of what it's labelled there, region of declining revenue. So if we were to cut our tax rate, then what might happen is that the government might be able to collect more tax in total. The reason for that being that if tax rates fall, some people who are maybe working part-time, not doing overtime, because tax rates are too high, they might suddenly change their behaviour if the government cut tax rates. And the amount of income declared to the government for tax purposes might rise by more than, in proportionate terms, the fall in the rate of tax. And if that happens, mathematically, the total amount of tax collected will rise. So this is also some arguments in favour of this classical school view that if you actually cut taxes, that might be a really effective way of reducing a fiscal deficit, because cutting taxes creates massive incentives to work. All of a sudden, you've got people working full-time rather than part-time, you've got a thriving economy, you've got businesses growing. All of these are extra sources of tax income for the government, and those extra sources of tax income will help to reduce the fiscal deficit. So let's think about some conclusions then. Keynesians, Keynes is the guy on the left there as I'm looking at it, they believe that the best way to reduce a fiscal deficit is by pursuing reflationary demand-side policies that are designed to create economic growth. So the Keynesian logic is to reduce a fiscal deficit in the long run, it's normally necessary to increase it in the short run. The increasing it in the short run bit is all about creating a fiscal stimulus, and that fiscal stimulus creates the growth that then reduces the fiscal deficit in the long run. Keynesians are very, very hostile to fiscal austerity. They think that if the government either puts up taxes or cuts government spending, that's taking aggregate demand out of the economy, and that will lead to a fall in GDP. And that fall in GDP, rather than making the fiscal deficit smaller, it will actually increase it. So the Keynesians are very, very hostile to the idea of fiscal austerity. They believe it's self-defeating. In contrast, classical economists and Austrians like Hayek, they believe that fiscal austerity isn't self-defeating. And at the heart of their belief is the idea that the level of aggregate demand does not affect the level of output and employment. Classical economists believe that output and employment is determined by supply side factors, not the level of aggregate demand. So the government can cut government spending all it wants without it leading to a recession. And furthermore, if you cut certain aspects of government spending like welfare, rather than the fiscal deficit rising, it will actually start to fall because people will respond to incentives by working harder. If you cut welfare, that will encourage people to go out and work because they have to. Similarly, if you cut tax rates, you could end up with more tax collected in total, again because of incentive effects. So that's a classical school view. If you want to get rid of a fiscal deficit, the best thing that you can do is to roll back the frontiers of the state and cut government spending. So that's basically the difference then. So the Keynesians, they believe that the best way to reduce a fiscal deficit is by spending more, and which is counterintuitive. And the classical school is, if you want to cut a fiscal deficit, the government needs to spend less, and that's about it. I hope you found this useful.